The candle on the desk flickered as the door slammed shut behind her, and Alina Whitmore felt her heart pounding before she even looked up. Duke Alaric Ashworth stood by the window, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him like a man about to deliver a verdict rather than a request. She had been summoned without warning, pulled away from folding linens in the servants' hall, and marched up 3 flights of stairs by a footman who would not meet her eyes. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the silence of the room, in the way the fire crackled too loudly, in the way the Duke did not turn around to greet her. "You sent for me, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady even though her hands were not. He turned then, and the look on his face made her stomach twist. It was not anger, it was something colder, calculation. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore," he said. She did not sit. She had learned long ago that when powerful men told you to sit, it was rarely for your comfort. Alaric walked to his desk and opened a drawer. From it, he withdrew a leather pouch, heavy enough that it made a dull sound when he set it down. He pushed it across the polished wood toward her. "There is enough gold in that pouch to buy a house in any town of your choosing, enough to start a business, or to live comfortably for the rest of your days without lifting a finger. All I ask in return is that you leave this estate tonight, and that you never return." For a moment, Alina thought she had misheard him. She looked at the pouch, then at his face, searching for some sign that this was a jest, some cruel test of her loyalty. But his eyes did not waver. "Leave," she repeated, "tonight." "Yes, and never return." "That is correct." She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from something sharper, something that tasted like betrayal even though she had no claim to loyalty from this man. She had worked in his household for 3 years. She had nursed his grandmother through a fever that nearly took her life. She had mended his coats, remembered his preferences without being asked, and never once given him reason to doubt her character. And now he sat before her with a bag of coins, as though her presence in his home was a debt to be settled and erased. "May I ask why, Your Grace?" "You may not." The bluntness of his answer stung more than she expected. She stared at the pouch on the desk, at the candlelight catching the worn leather, and something inside her hardened. "I don't want your gold," she said. Alaric's brow lifted slightly, the first crack in his composure. "Excuse me." "I said I don't want it. If you wish me gone, you need only say so plainly, and I will pack my things tonight. But I will not take money for leaving a place I never wished to be forced from. I have done nothing wrong, and I will not let you pay me as though I have." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire popped in the hearth. Somewhere below, a clock struck the hour, its chimes muffled by the thick walls of the estate. Alaric studied her, and for the first time since she had entered the room, something like uncertainty flickered across his features. "You would leave with nothing?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "I would leave with my dignity," Alina said. "That is worth more to me than any sum you could offer." She turned before he could respond and walked to the door. Her hand rested on the handle, and she paused, waiting for him to call her back, to explain himself, to offer some reason that might make sense of the cruelty in his request. But he said nothing. And so she opened the door and stepped out into the corridor, leaving the pouch of gold untouched on his desk. She did not cry. She had promised herself long ago that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of her tears, not even in private. Instead, she walked back to the small room she shared with 2 other maids, and she began to fold her few belongings into the same worn bag she had arrived with 3 years earlier. A woolen shawl, 2 dresses, a small wooden box that had belonged to her mother, containing nothing of value except a faded ribbon and a folded letter she had never been able to bring herself to read in full. As she packed, footsteps approached in the hallway, softer than the Duke's heavy stride. The door creaked open, and the Dowager Duchess Margaret stood there, leaning on her cane, her silver hair catching the lamplight. "Alina," the old woman said, her voice trembling, "what is this I hear? Are you truly leaving?" Alina did not look up from her folding. "Your grandson has asked me to." "Asked you or told you? Does it matter?" Margaret stepped into the room and lowered herself onto the edge of the narrow bed, her cane resting against her knee. It matters a great deal, child. Tell me exactly what he said. Alina recounted the conversation, her voice flat, as though describing something that had happened to someone else. When she finished, Margaret's expression had shifted from concern to something sharper, something like anger directed not at Alina but at the empty doorway, as though Alaric himself might be standing there to receive it. "That foolish, stubborn boy," Margaret muttered. "He thinks he is protecting something, when in truth he is destroying it with his own hands." "Protecting what, Your Grace?" Margaret looked at her for a long moment, and something in her gaze made Alina's chest tighten. It was pity, but it was also something else, something like recognition. "Never mind that now," the old woman said, waving a hand. "Where will you go?" "I have a cousin in the city. She has offered me a place before if I ever needed one. I suppose tonight I need one." Margaret reached out and took Alina's hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her age. "You have been a comfort to me these past years, more than my own family has managed to be. I will not forget your kindness, and I do not believe this is the end of your story, whatever my grandson believes he has accomplished tonight." Alina managed a small, tired smile. "You are kind to say so, Your Grace, but I think some stories simply end quietly without any grand purpose." "Perhaps," Margaret said, "or perhaps you simply cannot see the next chapter yet." There was nothing more to say after that. Alina finished packing as the old woman sat with her, offering what comfort silence could provide. When the bag was full, Alina slung it over her shoulder and helped Margaret to her feet, walking her slowly back to her own chambers before returning to collect her things one final time. The estate was quiet as she made her way toward the servants' entrance, the household staff already asleep or pretending to be, none of them willing to witness her departure and risk the Duke's displeasure. Only the housekeeper, a stern woman named Constance who had trained Alina in her earliest days at the estate, waited by the back door with a small parcel of bread and cheese wrapped in cloth. "You'll need this for the journey," Constance said gruffly, pressing the parcel into Alina's hands. "It's a long walk to the coaching inn and longer still to the city." "Thank you," Alina whispered. Constance hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, girl, I never believed you did anything to deserve this. Whatever reason he has, it isn't about you being unworthy. Remember that." Alina nodded, though she did not fully understand what Constance meant, and stepped out into the cold night air. The moon hung low over the estate's gardens, casting long shadows across the gravel path that led toward the main road. She did not look back at the house, at the windows glowing faintly with candlelight, at the life she had built there brick by brick over 3 quiet years. She simply walked, her bag heavy on her shoulder, her mother's wooden box pressed close against her chest, and let the darkness swallow the estate behind her. By the time she reached the coaching inn 2 hours later, her feet ached and her thoughts had grown numb with exhaustion. She paid for a seat on the early morning coach with the last of her small savings, and settled onto a hard bench in the inn's common room to wait out the remaining hours until dawn. Other travelers came and went, merchants and farmers and a young family bound for a wedding somewhere north, none of them paying her any mind. As she sat there, staring into the dying embers of the common room fire, she allowed herself, for the first time since leaving the Duke's study, to wonder why. Why had he wanted her gone so urgently, so completely, that he was willing to pay a fortune to be rid of her? She had committed no offense. She had never spoken out of turn, never overstepped her position, never given him cause for complaint. And yet something about her presence had clearly become intolerable to him, sudden and absolute. She thought of Margaret's words, "You have been a comfort to me these past years, more than my own family has managed to be," and the strange look on the old woman's face when she had asked what Alaric believed he was protecting. There was something she was not being told. She was certain of it now, sitting alone in the flickering firelight, her whole life reduced to a single bag at her feet. But whatever secret lay behind the Duke's sudden cruelty, she would not learn it tonight, and perhaps she would never learn it at all. The coach arrived just as the sky began to lighten at the edges, gray bleeding slowly into gold. Alina climbed aboard, found a seat by the window, and watched as the countryside began to slide past, the estate and everything it represented shrinking further behind her with every passing mile. She did not know, as the wheels rattled over the frozen road and the first true light of morning broke across the fields, that she was leaving behind far more than a position in a household. She did not know that the man who had just cast her out would spend years wondering if he had made the greatest mistake of his life. She did not know that the road ahead, however uncertain it seemed now, would lead her somewhere far beyond anything she could imagine sitting on that cold coach bench, clutching a small wooden box and the ache of an unanswered question. All she knew, as the first rays of sunlight touched her tired face, was that she would not look back again. Whatever waited for her in the city, whatever life she might build from nothing, she would build it on her own terms, without gold that came stained with rejection, without a name that had never truly welcomed her. The coach rolled onward, carrying her away from the only home she had known in years, and toward a future that neither she nor the Duke who had banished her could have possibly foreseen. 3 weeks before the night Alina Whitmore was cast out of Ashworth Hall, Duke Alaric Ashworth sat across from his grandmother in the estate's private drawing-room, listening to her speak with a fondness that made his blood run cold. Margaret had been recounting, with obvious delight, how Alina had spent an entire evening reading to her during her recovery from a winter fever, how the young woman had a gift for conversation that put the daughters of every noble family Margaret had ever met to shame, and how, in Margaret's considered opinion, Alaric could search the whole of the kingdom and never find a wife with half of Alina's quiet strength. "You are speaking as though you wish me to court a housekeeper's assistant," Alaric had said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I am speaking as though I wish you to open your eyes," Margaret had replied, her tone sharper than he expected. "You are betrothed to a woman you do not love, for reasons that have nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with land and alliances. Meanwhile, there is a woman living under this very roof who makes you smile more in a single conversation than Charlotte Vane has managed in 3 years of courtship. Do not think I have not noticed, Alaric. I raised you. I know your face better than you know it yourself." He had said nothing more that evening, choosing instead to retreat to his study with a glass of brandy and a mind that would not settle. He told himself that his grandmother was simply an old woman prone to romantic notions, that her fondness for Alina had colored her judgment, that there was nothing between himself and a servant beyond the ordinary courtesies of master and staff. But even as he told himself these things, he knew they were not entirely true. He remembered with uncomfortable clarity the morning 3 months earlier when he had come across Alina in the garden before dawn, sitting alone on a stone bench with a book open in her lap, though it was too dark to read. When he asked what she was doing, she had told him, with a small, embarrassed laugh, that she simply liked to sit outside before the household woke, to have a few moments that belonged only to her. He had sat down beside her without thinking, and they had talked until the sun rose about nothing of consequence, about her childhood in a small village, about his fear of never living up to his father's legacy, about books they had both loved as children. It was the most honest conversation he had had with anyone in years, and he had not told a single soul about it, least of all his grandmother, whose perceptiveness he now deeply regretted underestimating. There had been other moments too, small and easily dismissed on their own, but heavy when considered together. The way he found himself listening for her footsteps in the corridor, the way he had once nearly reached for her hand when she passed him a cup of tea, catching himself only at the last second. The way his engagement to Charlotte Vane, arranged by his late father for the sake of uniting 2 prosperous estates, had begun to feel less like a duty and more like a cage the closer the wedding date approached. Alaric had built his entire adult life around a single unbending principle, one instilled in him since boyhood by a father who valued reputation above all else. A duke did not marry for love. A duke married for advantage, for stability, for the continuation of a legacy that mattered more than any individual happiness. His father had drilled this lesson into him relentlessly, especially after Alaric's own mother had died when he was young, a woman his father always spoke of with a strange mixture of affection and resentment, as though loving her had been both the greatest joy and the greatest weakness of his life. "Love is a luxury for men who have nothing to lose," his father used to say. "We are not those men, Alaric, remember that." He had remembered it. He had built his entire identity around remembering it. And now, watching his grandmother's face light up as she spoke of Alina Whitmore, watching the easy, unguarded way he himself smiled at the mere mention of her name, he felt that carefully constructed identity beginning to crack. It terrified him. He told himself that if his grandmother could see it so plainly, others would soon see it too. Whispers would begin among the household staff, and eventually among the wider circle of nobility whose opinions determined the success or failure of every alliance his family had worked generations to build. Charlotte Vane's family was proud and easily offended, and any hint of scandal involving a servant girl could unravel an engagement that had taken his father years to negotiate before his death. Alaric could not allow sentiment, however powerful, to jeopardize everything his family had built. He would not become his father's cautionary tale, a man whose heart had cost him everything that mattered. And so, over the following weeks, he began to watch Alina differently. Not with warmth, but with suspicion, as though she were a threat that needed to be neutralized rather than a person he had come to genuinely care for. He avoided the garden at dawn. He stopped lingering in the corridors where their paths might cross. He grew short with her during the rare occasions their duties still required interaction, and told himself that the hurt flickering across her face on those occasions meant nothing at all. But it was not enough. His grandmother continued to sing Alina's praises at every opportunity, seemingly unaware of or unbothered by the tension her words created. And worse, Alaric found that his own resolve was weakening rather than strengthening with each passing day. He caught himself watching Alina across the length of a room, memorizing small details he had no business memorizing, the particular way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the sound of her quiet laughter when she thought no one important was listening. The final push came on an evening when Charlotte Vane visited the estate for dinner, accompanied by her mother, a formidable woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Alina had been asked to assist with serving that evening, as the household was short-staffed due to illness among the regular kitchen maids. Alaric watched, with growing dread, as Charlotte's mother observed Alina throughout the meal, her gaze narrowing each time Alaric's eyes drifted, however briefly, toward the young woman moving quietly around the table. After dinner, as the guests prepared to depart, Charlotte's mother drew Alaric aside under the pretense of discussing wedding arrangements. "That serving girl," she said, her voice low and pointed. "The one with the dark hair. I noticed you looking at her rather often this evening." Alaric's stomach dropped. "I assure you, madam, you are mistaken." "I am rarely mistaken about such things, your grace. I have seen this pattern before, in other households, with other men who believed themselves too clever to be caught. A word of advice, offered only out of respect for your late father's memory. Whatever fondness you may harbor for a girl of that station, it would be wise to extinguish it swiftly and completely, before it becomes a subject of gossip that reaches my daughter's ears, or worse, the ears of every family whose opinion matters to yours." The threat, though delivered with polite courtesy, was unmistakable. Alaric spent that entire night awake, pacing the length of his study, turning the woman's words over and over in his mind. He thought of his father's warnings about love as weakness. He thought of the engagement that stood between his family and financial ruin, an arrangement he had never openly admitted was as much about survival as tradition, given the mounting debts his father had left behind that few outside the family were aware of. He thought of Margaret's fondness for Alina, a fondness that could easily be misread by outside observers as something more deliberate, more scheming, than it truly was. And he thought of Alina herself, of the quiet dignity she carried even while performing the most menial tasks, of the honesty in her eyes that never once suggested she had any design on him or his position. She had done nothing wrong. He knew that with absolute certainty, and yet her mere presence had become, in the eyes of those who held power over his family's future, a liability too dangerous to ignore. By morning, he had convinced himself that there was only one solution. He could not risk dismissing her under any pretext that might raise questions or invite sympathy from his grandmother, who would surely intervene on Alina's behalf if she suspected the true reason. He needed something swift, something final, something that would remove Alina from the estate entirely before Charlotte's mother could act on her suspicions, before his own resolve could weaken any further, before his grandmother could deepen whatever plan she seemed to be quietly nursing. Gold seemed the simplest answer. A generous sum, enough to ensure Alina would have no cause for resentment, enough to convince himself that he was not truly casting her aside, but rather offering her an opportunity, a fresh start far away from a life of servitude. He told himself this was a kindness disguised as cruelty, that she would eventually understand, that perhaps she might even thank him one day for freeing her from a household that could offer her nothing but endless labor and no real future. It was, he would later understand, one of the greatest lies he ever told himself. He summoned her that very evening, before he could lose his nerve, before Margaret could return from visiting a neighboring estate and interfere with whatever fragile courage he had gathered. He rehearsed his words carefully beforehand, stripping them of any warmth, any explanation, anything that might reveal the truth beneath his decision. He needed her gone quickly and completely, and he believed, with the arrogance of a man who had never truly been refused anything in his life, that gold would make the entire matter simple. He had not expected her to refuse the money. He had not expected the flash of quiet fury in her eyes, or the steadiness in her voice as she told him she would rather leave with nothing than accept payment for her own humiliation. Watching her walk out of his study that night, leaving the pouch untouched on his desk, he felt something twist painfully in his chest, something he refused to name even in the privacy of his own thoughts. He told himself it was relief. He told himself the danger had passed, that Charlotte's mother would have no further cause for suspicion, that his family's future was secure once more. He poured himself a glass of brandy and sat alone in his study long after the candle had burned low, staring at the closed door through which Alina had disappeared. But relief, he would soon discover, was not what he felt at all. 2 days after her departure, Margaret returned from her visit and immediately noticed Alina's absence. When Alaric offered a vague explanation about the girl seeking better opportunities elsewhere, his grandmother studied him with an expression that made him deeply uncomfortable, as though she could see straight through the careful construction of his lie. "You sent her away," Margaret said quietly. It was not a question. "She chose to leave," Alaric replied, though the words tasted false even as he spoke them. Margaret's eyes, so like his own, held his gaze for a long moment. "I have lived a great many years, Alaric, and I have watched a great many foolish men make a great many foolish decisions in the name of protecting things that never needed protecting. I had hoped you would prove wiser than most. It seems I was mistaken." She said nothing further on the matter, but her disappointment lingered in the halls of Ashworth Estate for weeks afterward, a silent, constant reminder of the choice Alaric had made. He told himself repeatedly that he had done what duty required. That sentiment had no place in the calculations of a man responsible for an entire household's future. He told himself Alina would forget him in time, that she would build a new life far from the estate and never think of him again. He did not yet know how wrong he was about nearly everything. What he could not have known, as he sat alone in his study night after night, was that the very fever which had once brought Alina into his grandmother's closest confidence had also, quite by accident, revealed a secret that would eventually unravel everything he believed to be true about the world he had worked so hard to protect. Margaret, during her long recovery, had spoken more freely with Alina than she had with anyone in years, sharing old family stories, old regrets, and fragments of history that even Alaric had never been told. Among those fragments was a name Margaret had not spoken aloud in over 2 decades, the name of a distant relation whose disgrace had been quietly buried by the family generations ago. A name that, unbeknownst to either Margaret or Alaric, connected in ways neither of them could yet imagine to the very woman the Duke had just paid a fortune to make disappear. The city of Belmere announced itself long before Alina's coach reached its gates. a haze of chimney smoke rising above the horizon, the distant clatter of carts and voices growing louder with every mile. She had visited the city only twice before in her life, both times briefly, and the sheer size of it still unsettled her. The crowded streets, the towering buildings pressed so close together that sunlight seemed to struggle to reach the ground between them. But it was here that her cousin Margaret Price lived, a woman 10 years her senior who had left their shared village long ago to apprentice as a seamstress, and it was here that Alina hoped to rebuild whatever life remained to her. Margaret Price, not to be confused with the Dowager Duchess who shared her given name, greeted Alina at the coaching inn with open arms, and a face full of questions she was polite enough not to ask immediately. She was a small, energetic woman with quick hands and quicker wit, and she led Alina through the winding streets to a modest 2-room apartment above a bakery, filling the silence with cheerful chatter about the neighborhood, the bakery's excellent bread, and the small dress shop where she worked 6 days a week. It was only once they were settled inside, with cups of weak tea warming their hands, that Margaret Price finally asked the question Alina had been dreading. "So tell me, cousin, what happened? Your letter said only that you needed a place to stay, nothing more." Alina told her everything, or nearly everything, leaving out only the strange, unspoken feelings she had never quite allowed herself to examine too closely, the ones that had made the Duke's rejection sting far more than simple dismissal from employment ever should have. When she finished, her cousin sat quietly for a long moment, stirring her tea though there was nothing left to stir. "That is a strange thing to do," Margaret Price finally said. "A man does not pay a fortune to be rid of someone who means nothing to him. There is more to this story than you are telling me, or perhaps more than you yourself understand." "Perhaps," Alina admitted, "but it hardly matters now. I have no intention of returning to find out." Her cousin did not press further that evening, though Alina would catch her studying her with a thoughtful expression more than once over the following weeks, as though turning the puzzle over in her mind, and finding the pieces did not quite fit together in any way that made sense. Life in Belmere settled into a steady rhythm faster than Alina expected. Margaret Price secured her a position as an apprentice at the same dress shop where she herself worked, under the watchful eye of a demanding but fair proprietor named Mrs. Adeline Foxworth, who ran her small business with the precision of a military commander and the occasional flash of genuine warmth toward the women in her employ. Alina, who had always possessed a steady hand and an eye for detail from her years managing linens and mending garments at the estate, took to the work quickly, and within a few months she had become one of Mrs. Foxworth's most trusted seamstresses. The work was exhausting, long hours bent over fabric under lamplight, fingers pricked and sore by the end of each day, but there was something satisfying in it that Alina had not expected. Every dress she completed was entirely her own accomplishment, built with her own hands from nothing but thread and fabric and patience, owing nothing to the favor or displeasure of a duke who had once held the power to erase her from his life with a single sentence. For the first time in years, her livelihood depended on no one's approval but her own skill and her customers' satisfaction, and there was a quiet freedom in that which she had never known before. She thought of Alaric less than she expected to, though he still surfaced in her mind at unexpected moments, usually late at night when the apartment was silent and sleep refused to come. She would remember the dawn conversation in the garden, the easy warmth of it, and wonder what had changed so suddenly, so completely, that he could look at her across his desk and offer her gold as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience to be settled. She never arrived at an answer that satisfied her, and eventually she stopped searching for one, choosing instead to focus her energy on the life she was building rather than the one she had left behind. It was nearly a year after her arrival in Belmere that the first thread of what would become an extraordinary discovery presented itself, though Alina did not recognize its significance at the time. Mrs. Foxworth had sent her to deliver a finished gown to a client across the city, a wealthy widow named Mrs. Caldwell who lived in a grand townhouse near the edge of the merchant district. While waiting in the widow's parlor for payment to be arranged, Alina struck up a conversation with an elderly gentleman also waiting nearby, a family solicitor named Mr. Harold Bennett, who had come to discuss matters of inheritance with Mrs. Caldwell. Mr. Bennett, a talkative man who seemed to relish any opportunity for conversation, asked Alina about her family, and she answered honestly, mentioning her late father, a quiet man who had died when she was young, and whose past she knew very little about beyond the fact that he had arrived in her mother's village as a stranger, with no family connections and no explanation for where he had come from. She had always assumed he was simply a man of humble origins, like so many others who drifted between villages seeking work. But something in her description caught Mr. Bennett's attention, and he began asking questions with an intensity that surprised her. What was her father's name? Did she know his date of birth? Did she possess any documents or belongings that had once been his? Alina, startled by his interest, mentioned the small wooden box she still kept among her few possessions, containing a folded letter she had never fully read, one that her mother had told her, on her deathbed, to keep safe, but never open unless circumstances made it necessary. Mr. Bennett's eyes widened at this, and he asked with barely contained excitement whether she might be willing to show it to him. Alina hesitated. The letter had remained sealed for so long that opening it felt almost like a betrayal of her mother's final wishes, despite the fact that her mother had also told her that circumstances might one day make it necessary to read. But something about Mr. Bennett's urgency, combined with her own long-buried curiosity about her father's origins, convinced her to agree. She invited him to her cousin's apartment the following evening, and under the dim light of a single lamp, with Margaret Price watching nervously from the corner of the room, Alina finally broke the seal on the letter her mother had guarded for so many years. The handwriting inside was elegant, formal, entirely unlike the simple penmanship Alina had expected from a man she had always believed to be an ordinary laborer. The letter, addressed to her mother and dated some 20 years earlier, spoke of a man forced to abandon his birthright, of a family scandal that had stripped him of a title he had never wanted but had been born to regardless, of a distant kingdom called Varentine whose royal court had disowned him following accusations he swore, even in this private letter meant only for his wife's eyes, he had never truly committed. Alina read the words twice, her hands trembling, before looking up at Mr. Bennett, who was watching her with an expression somewhere between astonishment and vindication. "My father," she said slowly, "was not simply a man of humble origins." "No, my dear," Mr. Bennett said, his voice hushed with something like reverence. "If this letter is genuine, and I have every reason to believe it is, your father was born a Prince of Varentine, the second son of King Edmund III, disinherited under circumstances that were never fully explained to the public. There were rumors at the time, whispers of a conspiracy against him orchestrated by rivals within the court, but nothing was ever proven, and he vanished from all records shortly after his exile was announced. I have spent much of my career studying the history of noble families across the region, and I confess I never imagined I would find myself sitting in this room, holding proof that one of the great mysteries of Varentine's recent history has finally resurfaced." Alina sat in stunned silence, the letter trembling in her hands, as the full weight of what Mr. Bennett was suggesting began to settle over her. If what he said was true, if the letter truly proved her father's identity beyond doubt, then she was not simply the daughter of a humble laborer who had grown up in poverty and been dismissed from a duke's household with nothing but a bag of clothes and a wounded heart. She was the granddaughter of a king, the daughter of a prince, and depending on the laws of succession in a kingdom she had never even heard of until this very moment, potentially an heir to a throne that had stood empty of any clear claimant for over 2 decades. "This cannot be real," Alina finally whispered. "There must be some mistake." "There may well be complications," Mr. Bennett admitted. "Claims of this nature are rarely simple, and the court of Varentine will demand extensive proof before recognizing any inheritance, particularly given the political sensitivities surrounding your father's exile. But the letter alone is a significant piece of evidence, and if it can be corroborated with additional records, I believe you may have a legitimate claim worth pursuing." Margaret Price, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke, her voice tight with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Alina, do you understand what this means? You could be royalty. You, who were paid to disappear by a duke who thought you beneath his notice, might one day outrank him entirely." The thought, absurd as it seemed, sent a strange thrill through Alina's chest, though she immediately felt ashamed of the satisfaction it brought her. She reminded herself that nothing was certain yet, that a single letter, however compelling, was not proof enough to build an entire future upon, and that even if the claim proved true, the path ahead would likely be long and difficult, filled with political complications she could scarcely begin to imagine. But that night, after Mr. Bennet had departed with a promise to begin quietly investigating further on her behalf, Alina lay awake in the small apartment above the bakery, staring at the ceiling, turning the impossible possibility over and over in her mind. She thought of her father, a quiet, gentle man who had never once hinted at the extraordinary life he had left behind, who had chosen instead to raise her in humble circumstances, protecting her. She now understood, from a past too dangerous to speak of even to his own child. She thought of her mother, who had carried this secret for years, entrusting it to a single sealed letter, uncertain whether it would ever need to be opened at all. And she thought, unwillingly, of Alaric, of the cold finality in his voice, as he had offered her gold to vanish from his life forever, believing her to be nothing more than a servant's daughter unworthy of his attention, beyond a transaction meant to erase her presence. She wondered, with a bitter satisfaction she immediately tried to suppress, what he would think if he could see her now, sitting in a modest apartment with a letter that suggested she carried royal blood in her veins, a lineage that, should it prove true, would dwarf his own noble title entirely. She did not yet know how long the road ahead would be, how many months of investigation and verification lay between this moment and any true resolution. She did not know whether the kingdom of Valentine would even acknowledge her claim, or whether political forces long dormant might rise again to oppose her, just as they had once conspired against her father. But for the first time since walking out of Alaric's study with her dignity intact and nothing else, Alina felt something stir inside her that she had not expected to feel again so soon. Hope. Not hope for gold, or title, or revenge against the man who had cast her aside so carelessly, but hope that perhaps the life she had been forced to leave behind was never truly the whole of her story, that somewhere beneath the humble circumstances of her upbringing lay a truth far larger and far more remarkable than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. She fell asleep that night with the sealed letter resting on the small table beside her bed, its contents no longer secret, its weight no longer hers to carry alone. And in the morning, when she woke to the smell of fresh bread rising from the bakery below and the sound of her cousin already stirring in the next room, she rose with a new sense of purpose she had not felt in over a year, ready to discover exactly how far the truth of her father's letter might carry her. The weeks following Mr. Bennet's discovery passed in a blur of quiet, careful investigation. He had warned Alina from the outset that a claim of this magnitude could not be rushed, that any hint of carelessness or premature announcement might invite skepticism, or worse, danger from those who had once benefited from her father's exile and might not welcome his descendant reappearing to challenge old arrangements. And so, rather than making any public declaration, Mr. Bennet worked quietly through his network of contacts, gathering records, cross-referencing dates, and building a case that could withstand the scrutiny of a royal court known for its caution. Alina continued working at Mrs. Foxworth's dress shop throughout this period, partly out of necessity, since her modest savings would not sustain her indefinitely, and partly because the familiar rhythm of the work gave her something steady to hold on to while the rest of her world seemed to shift beneath her feet. Mrs. Foxworth, who had grown genuinely fond of her most diligent seamstress, noticed the change in Alina almost immediately, the distracted pauses over half-finished hems, the faraway look that sometimes crossed her face in the middle of a conversation. "You seem troubled lately," Mrs. Foxworth remarked one afternoon, as Alina sat threading a needle with far more concentration than the simple task required. Is everything well with your family? Alina hesitated, unsure how much to share even with a woman she had come to trust. There have been some unexpected developments, she finally said. Nothing I can speak of yet, but they have given me a great deal to think about. Mrs. Foxworth studied her for a long moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied that whatever troubled her young employee was not a matter that required further prying. Whatever it is, I hope it resolves in your favor. You have a good heart, Alina. Good hearts deserve good fortune, though the world does not always cooperate. If only she knew, Alina thought, how strangely fitting those words would soon prove to be. Mr. Bennet returned to the apartment above the bakery nearly a month after their first meeting, this time accompanied by a second man, tall and formally dressed, whom he introduced as Ambassador Colin Whitfield, a diplomat who had once served in Valentine's royal court before the political upheaval that followed her father's exile. The ambassador's presence in the small, humble apartment felt almost surreal, his fine clothing and careful manners standing in stark contrast to the modest surroundings, and Alina found herself suddenly self-conscious of the worn furniture and simple decorations that made up her temporary home. "Miss Whitmore," Ambassador Whitfield began, once introductions had been made and tea had been poured, "Mr. Bennet has shared with me the contents of your father's letter, along with the supporting documents he has managed to gather over the past several weeks. I must tell you, having served in Valentine's court during the very period your father's exile occurred, that the details align remarkably well with what little was ever publicly known about that unfortunate affair." "Then you believe the letter is genuine," Alina said. "I believe it merits serious investigation, at the very least," the ambassador replied carefully. "Your father, Prince Edwin of Valentine, vanished from public record so completely, and so suddenly, that many within the court simply assumed he had died in obscurity somewhere, unable or unwilling to reclaim any part of the life he had been forced to abandon. His disappearance was, if I may speak candidly, deeply convenient for certain factions within the court who benefited from his absence, and who worked quickly to ensure that questions about the circumstances of his exile were never seriously pursued." "What factions?" Alina asked, a chill running through her despite the warmth of the tea in her hands. Ambassador Whitfield exchanged a glance with Mr. Bennet before answering. "There were accusations made against your father at the time, claims that he had conspired against his own father, the king, plotting to seize power through illegitimate means. He was never given a proper trial, never allowed to defend himself publicly. He was simply stripped of his title and quietly exiled, with the official records suggesting he had willingly renounced his claim to the throne out of some personal crisis of conscience, a version of events that many at court privately doubted even then." "You believe he was innocent," Alina said quietly. "I believe, and I am not alone in this belief among those who remember the affair, that your father was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by his elder brother, Prince Reginald, who stood to inherit the throne uncontested once your father was removed from the line of succession. Whether Prince Reginald acted alone or with the support of others within the court, we may never fully know. But the timing of the accusations, occurring just months before your father's planned marriage to a woman of considerable political influence in her own right, always struck many observers as suspicious." Alina sat in stunned silence, absorbing the full weight of what the ambassador was describing. Her father, the quiet, gentle man who had raised her in humble circumstances, teaching her to read by candlelight and comforting her through childhood illnesses with a patience she had always cherished, had once stood at the center of a royal conspiracy so significant that its aftershocks still rippled through Valentine's court decades later. "What happened to Prince Reginald?" she asked. "He assumed the throne some years after your father's exile, following the death of King Edmund III, Ambassador Whitfield said. "He ruled for nearly 15 years before his own death 2 years ago, leaving behind no legitimate heirs of his own. The throne has technically remained vacant since then, managed by a regency council, while the court searches for any legitimate claimant to the succession. Distant cousins have put forward claims, though none with particularly strong legal standing, and the political situation within Valentine has grown increasingly unstable as various factions jockey for influence over the eventual succession. The implications of this settled over Alina slowly, like a weight pressing down on her chest. If her father's claim to the throne had never been legally extinguished, only interrupted by an unjust exile, and if Prince Reginald had died without producing an heir of his own, then the line of succession might well fall to her, as the daughter and only known descendant of the rightful, wrongly exiled prince. "You are suggesting I might have a legitimate claim to the throne of Valentine," she said slowly, testing the words as though speaking them aloud might make them either more real or more absurd. "I am suggesting," Ambassador Whitfield said, "that the possibility exists and that it deserves serious formal investigation by the proper legal channels within Valentine's court. I must be honest with you, Miss Whitmore. This will not be a simple or swift process. There will be those within the court who benefited from the current uncertainty, and who will resist any claim that threatens to resolve it in a manner they cannot control. There may be those who question the authenticity of your father's letter, who demand proof beyond what a single document can provide. And there will almost certainly be political maneuvering from various factions seeking to either support or undermine your claim, depending on how it serves their own interests." "But you believe it is worth pursuing," Alina said. "I believe," the ambassador said, his expression serious, "that a kingdom deserves a legitimate ruler, and that the truth of what happened to your father deserves to be brought into the light after so many years buried in convenient silence. Whether you choose to pursue this claim is, of course, entirely your decision. It will not be an easy path, and it will change your life irrevocably, whatever the outcome. But I am prepared to assist you, along with Mr. Bennet, if you decide to proceed." Alina looked down at her hands, calloused now from months of needlework, hands that had once folded linens and mended coats in a duke's household, hands that had packed a single bag on a cold night when she was cast out with nothing but a pouch of gold she had refused to accept. She thought of her mother's letter, kept sealed and hidden for so many years, entrusted with a truth too dangerous to speak aloud until circumstances made it necessary. She thought of her father's quiet strength, the way he had rebuilt an entire life from nothing after losing everything, never once burdening her with the weight of his lost kingdom. And she thought, unbidden, of Alaric, of the cold calculation in his eyes as he had offered her gold to disappear, believing her presence to be nothing more than a liability to be managed and erased. She wondered briefly, and with a flicker of something she did not fully understand, what he would think if he could see her now, sitting across from an ambassador of a foreign court, being told that she might be the rightful heir to an entire kingdom. "I want to pursue it," she said finally, her voice steady despite the enormity of the decision. "Not for the throne itself, not for power or wealth, but because my father deserved better than what was done to him, and because the truth deserves to be known, whatever the consequences might be." Ambassador Whitfield nodded, a flicker of something like admiration crossing his composed features. "Then we shall begin the formal process immediately. I must warn you, Miss Whitmore, that once this investigation begins in earnest, it will become increasingly difficult to keep your identity private. Word travels quickly among the noble houses, and there will be those who take a keen interest in your story, for better or worse." Alina thought of the Duke's estate, of the Dowager Duchess Margaret who had shown her such unexpected kindness, of Alaric himself, who had worked so hard to erase her from his life. If word of this investigation reached them, she wondered what they would think, what they would feel, knowing that the woman he had paid to vanish forever might soon be recognized as royalty in her own right. She pushed the thought aside, unwilling to let old wounds influence a decision that mattered far more than any lingering resentment toward the Duke who had once discarded her so easily. This was about her father, about justice long delayed, about a truth that deserved to see daylight after 20 years buried beneath convenient lies. "Let us begin," she said. Over the following months, the investigation unfolded with a slow, methodical intensity that tested Alina's patience at every turn. Documents were verified against historical records held in Valentine's royal archives. witnesses from the era of her father's exile, elderly courtiers and former servants who still remembered the scandal, were quietly interviewed and asked to corroborate details from the letter. A physician was consulted to compare descriptions of her father's appearance against portraits still held in the royal gallery, and to Alina's quiet astonishment, the resemblance in bone structure and coloring, once pointed out, seemed unmistakable. Throughout it all, Alina continued her work at Mrs. Foxworth's dress shop, unwilling to abandon the steady, honest life she had built in Belmere until the investigation reached some definitive conclusion. She told no one beyond her cousin Margaret Price about the true nature of the inquiries occurring in the background of her ordinary days, and even Margaret, sworn to secrecy, found it increasingly difficult to contain her excitement as the evidence continued to mount in Alina's favor. It was nearly 8 months after that first fateful meeting with Mr. Bennet, when Ambassador Whitfield returned once more to the small apartment above the bakery, this time with news that would change the entire trajectory of Alina's life, beyond anything she had yet allowed herself to fully imagine. Ambassador Whitfield arrived that afternoon with an expression Alina had not seen on his face before, a carefully restrained excitement that made her heart begin to race even before he spoke a single word. Mr. Bennet accompanied him once again, along with a third figure Alina did not recognize, an older woman dressed in the formal robes of what appeared to be a legal official, her posture rigid with the kind of authority that came from years spent within the halls of a royal court. "Miss Whitmore," Ambassador Whitfield began, once they had all settled into the small parlor, "allow me to introduce Chief Magistrate Odette Renard, who has overseen the formal review of your claim on behalf of Valentine's Regency Council." Alina rose to greet the magistrate, her hands trembling slightly despite her effort to appear composed. "Magistrate Renard, thank you for coming such a distance." "The distance was well worth it," Magistrate Renard replied, her voice measured and precise. "I have spent the better part of 8 months reviewing every document, every testimony, every piece of physical evidence connected to your claim, Miss Whitmore, and I have done so with the deepest skepticism, as is required in matters of such significant consequence to the kingdom's future. I want you to understand that skepticism, because it makes what I am about to tell you all the more meaningful." Alina held her breath. "The Regency Council has reviewed my findings and voted unanimously to formally recognize your claim," the magistrate continued. "The evidence is conclusive. Your father, Prince Edwin of Valentine, was indeed the second son of King Edmund III, wrongfully accused and exiled through a conspiracy we now have substantial reason to believe was orchestrated by his elder brother, the late King Reginald. As his only known legitimate descendant, and given that King Reginald died without producing an heir, the line of succession falls to you, Miss Whitmore. Pending a final ceremonial confirmation before the full assembly of Valentine's noble houses, you will be recognized as the rightful sovereign of Valentine." For a long moment, Alina could not speak. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the weight of the magistrate's words settling over her with an intensity that made the modest parlor, with its worn furniture and simple curtains, feel suddenly too small to contain the scale of what she had just been told. She thought of her father, gone now for many years, who had died believing his story would never be known, who had raised her in humble obscurity to protect her from a danger he had never fully explained. She thought of her mother, who had kept the letter sealed for so long, uncertain whether the truth would ever need to see daylight. And she thought with a strange, breathless clarity that she was about to become a queen. "I do not know what to say," she finally managed. "You need say nothing yet," Magistrate Renard replied, a rare softness entering her formal tone. "There is a great deal to prepare, and the transition will not be without its difficulties. There are factions within the court who supported alternative claimants and who will not welcome this outcome, however solid the evidence in your favor. You will need to move carefully, and you will need allies you can trust absolutely, given the political complexities ahead." Margaret Price, who had been sitting quietly in the corner throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "She has people who will stand behind her. She has family." Magistrate Renard nodded approvingly. "That will serve you well, Your Highness." The title, spoken aloud for the first time, sent a jolt through Alina that she was not entirely prepared for. Your Highness. It felt impossibly foreign, a title belonging to someone else entirely, someone grander and more certain of her place in the world than the seamstress who had spent the last 18 months bent over fabric under lamplight, mending hems for a modest wage. The following months unfolded at a pace that left Alina feeling perpetually breathless, as though she were being swept along by a current far stronger than her own will. She traveled to Valentine for the first time in her life, escorted by Ambassador Whitfield and a small contingent of guards assigned for her protection, and found herself standing before the grand palace that had once belonged to her father, a structure so vast and ornate that it took her breath away even from a distance. The palace staff, uncertain how to receive a queen who had until recently been an unknown seamstress from a distant city, treated her with a mixture of deference and quiet curiosity, watching her every move as though searching for some sign that she would prove worthy of the throne she was about to inherit. Alina knew she had a great deal to learn, and she approached the challenge with the same steady determination that had once made her one of Mrs. Foxworth's most reliable seamstresses. She studied Valentine's history late into the night, memorizing the names and allegiances of the noble houses she would need to navigate, learning the intricate rules of court etiquette that governed everything from formal address to the proper way to receive foreign dignitaries. She met with Magistrate Renard almost daily, absorbing lessons on governance and law with an intensity that impressed even her most demanding instructors, and she cultivated a small but fiercely loyal circle of advisors, including Ambassador Whitfield and a young court secretary named Julian Ashford, whose sharp intellect and unwavering honesty quickly made him one of her most trusted confidants. Not everyone within the court welcomed her arrival with open arms. A faction led by Duchess Isolde Marchetti, a distant cousin of the late King Reginald who had harbored her own ambitions toward the throne, worked quietly to undermine Alina's legitimacy at every turn, spreading rumors that questioned the authenticity of her father's letter, and suggesting that Alina was little more than a commoner attempting to exploit a conveniently timed discovery for personal gain. Alina, though wounded by the accusations, refused to respond with anger or defensiveness, choosing instead to let her actions speak louder than any rumor could. She visited the poorer districts of Valentine's capital personally, something no previous ruler had bothered to do in living memory, listening to the concerns of ordinary citizens with the same patient attention she had once given to Mrs. Foxworth's most demanding clients. She reformed outdated taxation policies that had burdened the kingdom's farmers for decades, drawing on her own experience of poverty and hardship to identify inequities that career politicians, insulated by privilege, had never thought to question. She established a fund to support young women seeking apprenticeships in trades traditionally closed to them, remembering her own gratitude toward Mrs. Foxworth for the opportunity that had once given her purpose and independence during the most uncertain period of her life. Slowly, steadily, the rumors spread by Duchess Marchetti began to lose their power against the growing evidence of Alina's genuine care for her people. Citizens who had initially greeted news of an unknown seamstress ascending to the throne with skepticism began to speak of her with a warmth and respect that surprised even Alina herself. She was not, they said, a queen who ruled from behind palace walls, distant and unreachable. She was a queen who understood hardship because she had lived it, who understood the value of honest work because she had built her own life with her own two hands before any crown had ever been offered to her. 6 months after her formal recognition, Alina stood before the full assembly of Valentine's noble houses, dressed in robes of deep blue and silver that had been carefully crafted, at her own insistence, by Mrs. Foxworth's dress shop back in Belmere, a small but deliberate tribute to the life and skills that had sustained her through her most difficult years. The ceremony was solemn and lengthy, filled with ancient rituals and formal declarations that stretched on for hours, but Alina felt none of the fear she might once have expected in such a moment. Instead, she felt a quiet, steady confidence, born not of arrogance, but of hard-won competence. The knowledge that she had earned this position not through birth alone, but through months of tireless preparation and genuine dedication to the people she now served. When the crown was finally placed upon her head, an ornate circlet of gold and sapphire that had once belonged to her grandfather, King Edmund III, Alina felt the weight of it settle not as a burden but as a promise, a solemn commitment to govern with the same integrity and care that had defined her father's brief, tragically interrupted reign as heir apparent, decades before injustice had stolen his rightful future. Duchess Isolde Marchetti, present in the assembly despite her earlier opposition, offered a stiff but formal bow of acknowledgement as the ceremony concluded, recognizing, however reluctantly, that Alina's position was now beyond meaningful challenge. It was not friendship, not yet, and perhaps not ever entirely, but it was a truce, a grudging acceptance that the kingdom had found its rightful sovereign at last. In the weeks that followed her coronation, Alina settled into the rhythms of governance with the same steady diligence that had once carried her through her darkest days in Belmere. She corresponded regularly with Margaret Price, who had chosen to remain in Belmere despite Alina's repeated invitations to join her at the palace, preferring the familiar comforts of her modest life and her work at Mrs. Foxworth's shop, though she promised to visit often. Alina also arranged for a generous pension to be settled on Mrs. Foxworth and Mr. Bennet, whose early kindness and diligent investigation had made her entire remarkable journey possible. But even amid the whirlwind of her new responsibilities, amid the ceremonies and council meetings and the endless demands of a kingdom eager for strong, compassionate leadership, Alina found her thoughts drifting occasionally back to Ashworth Estate, to the Dowager Duchess Margaret who had shown her such unexpected warmth during her years there, and despite every effort to suppress the thought, to Duke Alaric Ashworth himself, the man who had once looked her in the eye and offered her gold to disappear from his life forever. Word of Valentine's new queen had surely reached his ears by now, she suspected, given how quickly news of royal successions traveled across kingdoms, particularly ones as unusual and remarkable as her own. She wondered, though she told herself she should not care, whether he had connected the name Alina Whitmore to the servant girl he had once dismissed so callously, whether the news had shocked him, or troubled him, or meant nothing to him at all beyond a passing curiosity about a strange coincidence of names. She told herself it did not matter. She had built an entire new life, an entire new identity, rising from the humblest of circumstances to the very pinnacle of power and influence, without any help from him, without any need of his approval or his regret. Whatever he thought of her ascension, whatever guilt or indifference he might feel upon learning the truth, was no longer her concern. And yet late at night, when the palace grew quiet and the endless demands of governance finally allowed her a few private moments of reflection, she found herself wondering, against her own better judgment, what it might feel like to stand before him again, not as the servant he had once cast aside without a second thought, but as the sovereign he had never imagined she could become. She did not have to wonder for very much longer. Duke Alaric Ashworth first heard the name Alina Whitmore spoken in connection with the throne of Valentine on an ordinary autumn evening, while reviewing correspondence in his study with the same disciplined focus he applied to every matter concerning his estate. A letter from a business associate mentioned, almost in passing, the remarkable news spreading through diplomatic circles about a foreign kingdom's newly recognized sovereign, a woman of humble origins whose extraordinary rise had captivated the attention of nobility across several neighboring territories. The letter included her name as a curious footnote, nothing more, and Alaric read it twice before the full weight of recognition settled over him like a physical blow. He sat perfectly still for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in his hand, certain there must be some mistake, some coincidence of names that meant nothing at all. Alina was not an uncommon name. Whitmore, though less common, was hardly unique enough to guarantee this was truly the same woman he had once known, the same woman he had cast out of his household with a pouch of gold she had refused to accept. But some instinct, some quiet certainty he could not fully explain, told him it was her. He spent the following days making careful, discreet inquiries through his network of contacts, and with each new piece of information that reached him, the impossible truth grew increasingly undeniable. The new Queen of Verentine had once worked as a seamstress in the city of Belmere. Before that, she had lived and worked for several years in a noble household some distance from the capital. Her cousin, a woman named Margaret Price, still resided in Belmere and had confirmed to a curious traveling merchant, without any particular discretion, that her cousin the Queen had once been employed at Ashworth Estate before an unexpected turn of fortune changed her life entirely. There could be no more doubt. The woman he had paid a fortune to disappear from his life forever had not simply vanished into obscurity, as he had assumed, and if he was honest with himself, hoped she would. She had instead ascended to a throne, becoming the sovereign ruler of an entire kingdom, a position that placed her, by any measure of rank or influence, far above his own. The revelation struck him with a force he had not anticipated, a complicated tangle of emotions he found himself unable to fully untangle even after days of turning the matter over in his mind. There was disbelief, certainly, at the sheer improbability of the story, at the notion that the quiet, dignified young woman who had once mended his coats and read to his grandmother during her illness had been, all along, the daughter of a wrongfully exiled prince. There was something almost like awe as well, a grudging admiration for the strength and resilience she must have shown to rise so far from such humble circumstances, strength he suspected she had possessed all along, hidden beneath the modest duties of her former position. But beneath all of it, underlying every other reaction, was a guilt so sharp and so persistent that it kept him awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling of his bedchamber, replaying that final conversation in his study over and over until the memory wore a groove into his thoughts. He remembered the flash of quiet fury in her eyes as she refused his gold. He remembered the steadiness in her voice as she told him she would leave with her dignity intact rather than accept payment for her own humiliation. He remembered walking away from that encounter convinced he had done what duty required, that he had successfully protected his family's future by removing a dangerous liability before it could cause real damage. He had not protected anything. He had cast aside a woman of extraordinary character, motivated by nothing more than his own fear of what other people might think, his own inability to reconcile genuine feeling with the rigid expectations his father had instilled in him since childhood. And now that woman sat upon a throne, ruling a kingdom with a wisdom and compassion that, according to every report reaching him, had already won the devotion of her people in a remarkably short span of time, while he remained exactly where he had always been, trapped within the same estate, bound by the same suffocating obligations he had sacrificed everything to preserve. His engagement to Charlotte Vane, he reflected bitterly, had dissolved less than a year after Alina's departure anyway, not due to any scandal or misstep on his part, but simply because Charlotte's family had found a more advantageous alliance elsewhere, one that offered greater financial benefit than the union with his own increasingly debt-burdened estate. All the careful calculation, all the sacrifice of genuine feeling for the sake of duty and reputation, had amounted to nothing in the end. He had given up something he now understood, with painful clarity, might have been the truest happiness he would ever have known, and he had received nothing in return but an empty engagement that collapsed regardless, and the hollow satisfaction of having done what his father would have called the responsible thing. His grandmother Margaret, when she learned the news of Alina's ascension, wept openly at the dinner table, tears of joy mixed unmistakably with vindication. "I told you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I told you there was something extraordinary in that girl, something you were too blind or too frightened to see clearly. And now look what you gave away with your gold and your cowardice." Alaric had no defense to offer. He sat in silence, absorbing his grandmother's words without protest, because every accusation she leveled against him was entirely deserved. In the weeks that followed, he found himself unable to focus on the ordinary demands of managing his estate, his thoughts constantly drifting toward Verentine, toward the woman he had once known so briefly and dismissed so completely. He read every scrap of news he could find about her reign, each report only deepening his admiration and his regret in equal measure. She had reformed unjust taxation policies that had burdened the poorest farmers of her kingdom for generations. She had established programs to support young women seeking trades and apprenticeships, remembering, he suspected, her own years working as a seamstress before fortune had intervened so dramatically. She had visited the poorest districts of her capital personally, listening to her citizens' concerns with a patience and genuine care that no previous ruler of Varentine had ever bothered to show. Every account he read painted a portrait of a woman who had grown into her extraordinary circumstances with grace, wisdom, and an unshakable sense of justice. Qualities he now recognized had always been present in her, even during the humble years she had spent within his own household, qualities he had been too consumed by fear and duty to properly appreciate at the time. He considered, more than once, writing to her directly, attempting some form of apology or explanation for his cruel and cowardly behavior on that final night at his estate. But every letter he attempted felt inadequate, hollow, unworthy of the wrong he had done her. What words could possibly account for the callousness of offering a woman gold to erase her existence from his life, simply because he lacked the courage to defy the expectations of a father long dead, and a social order that valued reputation above genuine human connection? He tore up letter after letter, unable to find words that felt honest enough to send, until finally, nearly a year after learning the truth of her ascension, an official invitation arrived at Ashworth Estate, delivered by a formal courier bearing the seal of Varentine's royal court. Queen Alina of Varentine, the letter announced in careful, formal language, would be undertaking a diplomatic tour of neighboring territories in the coming months, seeking to establish trade agreements and strengthen relations with houses whose lands bordered her own kingdom's interests. Ashworth Estate, given its strategic location and long history of trade relationships with the broader region, had been included among the noble houses she intended to visit personally during her tour. Alaric read the letter 3 times before the full implications settled over him. She was coming here, to this very estate, to the same study where he had once offered her gold to leave forever, believing he would never have to face the consequences of that choice again. His hands trembled slightly as he set the letter down on his desk, the same desk where the pouch of untouched gold had once rested between them. He did not know what to expect from her arrival, whether she would come seeking some form of confrontation, some measure of justice for the cruelty he had shown her, or whether she would simply treat him with the cool, professional courtesy befitting a diplomatic visit between a sovereign and a duke whose personal history no longer held any bearing on matters of state. Whatever awaited him, he understood with absolute certainty that he owed her an honest reckoning with his own past behavior, whether she chose to acknowledge it or not. He spent the following weeks in a state of restless anticipation, preparing the estate for her arrival with a meticulous care he had never applied to any other diplomatic visit in his years as duke, and preparing himself, as much as any man could prepare for facing the full weight of his own past mistakes, for the moment when Alina Whitmore, now Queen Alina of Varentine, would walk back through the doors of Ashworth Estate as a sovereign rather than a servant, wearing a crown he had never imagined she would come to hold. The morning of Queen Alina's arrival dawned crisp and clear, sunlight spilling across the gardens of Ashworth Estate in a way that felt almost mockingly cheerful given the tension gripping the household. Every member of the staff had spent the previous week preparing the estate to receive a sovereign, polishing silver, airing out the finest guest chambers, and rehearsing formal protocols under the exacting supervision of Constance, the housekeeper who had once pressed a parcel of bread and cheese into Alina's hands on the night of her departure, and who now moved through the corridors with an expression Alaric could not quite read, somewhere between pride and quiet vindication. The Dowager Duchess Margaret had insisted on being present for the arrival despite her advancing years and the protests of her physician, declaring that she would not miss this moment for anything the world might offer her. She sat now in the grand entrance hall in her finest gown, her cane resting against her chair, her eyes bright with an anticipation she made no effort to hide. Alaric stood beside her, dressed in formal attire befitting the occasion, his posture rigid with a nervousness he had not felt in years, not even during his own coronation ceremony following his father's death. He had faced difficult negotiations, hostile creditors, and the collapse of his own engagement without losing his composure. Yet the prospect of facing Alina again, after everything that had transpired, left him feeling as unsteady as a boy facing his first true test of character. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel finally announced her arrival, and the entire household staff arranged themselves along the entrance in careful formation, waiting with a mixture of curiosity and reverence for the woman who had once walked among them as a servant, and now returned as a queen. Alaric watched through the tall windows as the royal carriage, emblazoned with the crest of Valentine, rolled to a stop before the estate, flanked by a modest but dignified escort of guards. When the carriage door opened and Alina stepped down onto the gravel path, Alaric felt something catch in his chest that he could not immediately name. She wore robes of deep blue trimmed with silver, simple compared to the elaborate finery of many royal courts, yet somehow carrying a quiet authority that no amount of ornate decoration could have provided. Her dark hair was arranged elegantly beneath a modest circlet, and her posture, always naturally dignified even in her days as a servant, now carried an unmistakable weight of purpose and confidence that transformed her presence entirely. She was, Alaric realized with a jolt, utterly unrecognizable as the frightened young woman who had once packed a single bag in the middle of the night and disappeared into the darkness beyond the estate's gardens. And yet, beneath the crown and the formal robes, he could still see traces of the Alina he had once known, the same steady gaze, the same quiet strength that had first caught his attention years earlier during a dawn conversation in the garden neither of them had ever spoken of again. The Dowager Duchess Margaret rose from her chair with surprising speed, moving forward to greet Alina with open arms rather than the formal bow protocol technically required. "My dear girl," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Or should I say, Your Majesty? I always knew there was something extraordinary in you. I only wish I could have foreseen just how extraordinary." Alina's composed expression softened immediately at the sight of the old woman, genuine warmth breaking through the formal reserve she had maintained since stepping down from the carriage. "Your Grace," she said, embracing Margaret gently. "You have no idea how much your kindness meant to me, both then and now. I have thought of you often." "And I of you, my dear. Come, you must tell me everything. Though I suspect we shall need rather more time than a single afternoon allows." The formal introductions and diplomatic proceedings that followed consumed the remainder of the morning, with Alina meeting other members of the household staff, and discussing matters of trade and regional cooperation with the estate's stewards and advisors, all conducted with a professional grace that left even the most skeptical members of the staff visibly impressed. Alaric observed from a respectful distance throughout much of this, uncertain of his place in proceedings that felt simultaneously familiar and utterly transformed, waiting for some appropriate moment to approach her directly, though every attempt at composing what he might say dissolved the closer that moment approached. It was not until the late afternoon, following a formal luncheon that had proceeded with careful, polite conversation entirely devoid of any reference to the past both of them shared, that Alina finally approached him directly, requesting a private audience to discuss what she described only as a matter requiring personal attention. Alaric led her to his study, the same room where their final conversation years earlier had ended so coldly, and found his hands trembling slightly as he closed the door behind them, leaving the two of them alone for the first time since that fateful night. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Alina walked slowly across the familiar room, her gaze passing over the desk, the window, the very spot where she had once stood refusing his gold with quiet, unshakable dignity. Alaric watched her, searching her expression for some indication of what she might be feeling, but her composure remained steady and unreadable, the practiced calm of a woman who had learned to navigate far more difficult confrontations than this one during her time on the throne. "It is strange," she finally said, "to stand in this room again. I did not expect the memory to feel quite so vivid. Alina, Alaric began, then caught himself, uncertain of the proper address. Your Majesty, I owe you an apology so far beyond adequate that I scarcely know how to begin offering it. She turned to face him fully then, her dark eyes holding his with an intensity that made him want to look away, though he forced himself to meet her gaze directly, understanding that he owed her at least that much honesty. Then begin honestly, she said. That is all I have ever asked of anyone, and it is all I ask of you now. Alaric took a slow breath, steadying himself before speaking. What I did that night was cowardly. I told myself I was protecting my family's future, protecting an engagement that mattered for reasons of financial necessity I never explained to you, protecting a reputation my father had taught me to value above every other consideration. But the truth is simpler and far less honorable than any of that. I was frightened of what I felt for you, frightened of what others might say if they suspected that feeling, and rather than facing that fear honestly, I chose the cruelest possible solution. I tried to erase you from my life as though you were a problem to be solved rather than a person deserving of basic decency and respect. Alina listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, and Alaric forced himself to continue, understanding that half measures of honesty would serve neither of them now. I have thought of that night more times than I can count in the years since, he continued. I have thought of the way you refused my gold, of the dignity you carried out of this room even as I sat here convinced I had made the responsible choice. I did not understand, until long after you were gone, how deeply I had wronged you, and how much I had sacrificed, for nothing more than a fear that ultimately cost me the very things I believed I was protecting. My engagement dissolved regardless, for reasons entirely unrelated to any concern about you. I lost what I convinced myself I was gaining, and I lost you as well, though I had no right to consider you mine to lose in the first place. Alina was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression that had softened slightly, though it remained guarded, careful, the practiced composure of a woman who had learned not to offer trust easily to those who had once betrayed it. I will not pretend that night did not wound me deeply, she finally said. I built an entirely new life from the ashes of that rejection, Alaric. I worked as a seamstress, my hands sore and pricked from needlework, uncertain whether I would ever find stability again, let alone the extraordinary path my life eventually took. I carried the memory of your coldness with me through every one of those difficult early months, wondering what I had done to deserve such casual dismissal from a household I had served faithfully and honestly. You deserved none of it, Alaric said quietly. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. Perhaps, Alina said, but I have also learned, through everything that followed, that dwelling too long on old wounds serves no one well, least of all myself. I did not travel here today seeking an apology, though I confess it is a relief to finally receive one. I came here as the sovereign of Varentine, seeking to establish honest and productive relations with the noble houses bordering my kingdom's interests, including this one. Whatever happened between us personally does not change the practical necessity of that diplomatic purpose. Alaric absorbed this with a complicated mixture of relief and quiet disappointment, understanding that whatever hope he might have harbored for some deeper reconciliation was, at least for now, secondary to the formal purpose of her visit. Of course, he said. I understand entirely, and I am grateful for whatever relationship, diplomatic or otherwise, you are willing to extend toward this household after everything that transpired. Alina studied him for a long moment, something shifting subtly in her expression, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a warmth that had not been present since she first stepped into the study. I did not say there could be nothing beyond the diplomatic purpose, Alaric, she said quietly. I said only that I did not travel here today seeking your apology as my primary purpose. Whether something more might grow from this reunion remains to be seen, and depends a great deal on whether the honesty you have shown me today reflects a genuine change in the man you have become, or merely the convenient regret of someone confronted unexpectedly with the consequences of his own past choices. It was, Alaric understood, neither forgiveness nor rejection, but something more honest than either, an open door left carefully, deliberately ajar, awaiting whatever proof he might offer in the days ahead that he had truly grown beyond the fearful, dutiful man who had once offered her gold to disappear forever. "Then I will endeavor to prove myself worthy of that door remaining open," he said. "However long it takes, and whatever it requires of me." Alina allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at the estate, a small, genuine smile. "We shall see, Your Grace, we shall see." Queen Alina's diplomatic tour of the neighboring territories continued for several more weeks following her visit to Ashworth Estate, taking her through a series of noble houses and trading centers across the region, each visit conducted with the same careful professionalism that had characterized her time at Alaric's household. But she found herself, more often than she expected or entirely welcomed, thinking back to that conversation in his study, to the raw honesty in his voice as he had finally acknowledged the cruelty of his past behavior, to the careful, deliberate way he had accepted her measured response without protest or attempt at manipulation. It would have been easy, she reflected during the quiet hours of travel between one estate and the next, to close that door entirely, to treat her visit to Ashworth as nothing more than a formal diplomatic obligation, and move forward with her reign without ever looking back toward the man who had once wounded her so deeply. Many in her position, she suspected, would have chosen exactly that path, and no one could have blamed her for it. But Alina had never been a woman who found satisfaction in bitterness, however justified that bitterness might feel in the moment. She had built her entire life, from her earliest days as a housekeeper's daughter through her years as a seamstress, and now as a reigning queen, on a foundation of honesty and fairness, and she found she could not simply dismiss the possibility of genuine change in a man who had shown, however belatedly, real remorse for his past actions. She corresponded with the Dowager Duchess Margaret regularly throughout the remainder of her tour, their letters filled with warmth and genuine affection that had only deepened since their reunion. Margaret, never one to withhold her opinions, made her feelings on the matter of Alaric abundantly clear in nearly every letter she sent. "He speaks of you constantly," Margaret wrote in one particularly candid letter. "He has thrown himself into reforming the estate's finances and treatment of its staff with an energy I have not seen in him since he was a boy, before his father's lessons taught him to bury every genuine feeling beneath calculated duty. I do not ask you to forgive him simply because I love you both, but I do ask you to judge him by his actions in the months ahead, rather than by the mistakes of his past alone. People can change, Alina, when they are given honest reason to." Alina found herself returning to those words often during the quiet moments of her tour, weighing them carefully against her own cautious instincts, developed through hard experience, against trusting too easily or too quickly. Nearly 4 months after her initial visit to Ashworth Estate, as her diplomatic tour drew toward its conclusion, Alina received an unexpected letter from Alaric himself, the first direct communication between them since their conversation in his study. The letter was carefully written, free of the desperate pleading she might have expected from a lesser man, and instead detailed, in honest and specific terms, the changes he had implemented across his estate in the months since her visit. He described new fair wage policies for his household staff, modeled partly on reforms she herself had implemented within Valentine. He described his efforts to settle the estate's long-standing debts through careful management rather than another ill-considered arranged marriage. He described, with a vulnerability that struck her deeply, his ongoing efforts to understand and dismantle the rigid, fear-driven lessons his father had instilled in him since childhood, lessons that had led him to make the gravest mistake of his life on the night he offered her gold to disappear. "I do not write this letter seeking anything from you beyond your continued willingness to judge me honestly," the letter concluded. "I understand that trust, once broken, cannot be rebuilt through words alone, and I do not expect forgiveness simply because I have finally learned to recognize my own failings. But I wanted you to know that the door you left open, deliberately or not, has changed the entire direction of my life since your visit. Whatever comes of that, I remain grateful for the honesty you showed me, an honesty I did not deserve but have tried, in whatever small ways I can, to become worthy of receiving again. Alina read the letter several times over the following days, each reading bringing a slightly different mixture of emotions. Cautious hope tangled together with the lingering memory of old pain. Admiration for the genuine effort evident in his words, tempered by a healthy skepticism that had served her well throughout her extraordinary journey from servant to sovereign. She did not respond immediately, choosing instead to complete her diplomatic tour and return to Valentine to attend to the mounting responsibilities of her reign, which had continued to demand her full attention regardless of whatever personal matters occupied her private thoughts. But she kept his letter carefully among her most treasured possessions, alongside her mother's box and the ribbon and faded letter that had once revealed her father's true identity, a small but significant addition to the collection of items that had shaped the extraordinary path her life had taken. It was nearly a year after her initial visit to Ashworth Estate when Alina finally returned once more, this time not as part of a formal diplomatic tour, but through a private, carefully arranged visit that included only a small escort and no official state business whatsoever. Alaric received word of her impending arrival only days in advance, and the household staff, though considerably less anxious than during her first formal visit, still moved through the estate with a palpable sense of anticipation. When her modest carriage arrived, considerably less grand than the official royal procession that had marked her previous visit, Alaric met her personally at the entrance, dispensing with formal protocol entirely. Alina stepped down from the carriage dressed far more simply than before, her royal circlet absent entirely, her robes plain and comfortable, more reminiscent of the modest dresses she had once worn as a seamstress than the formal attire befitting a reigning queen. "You came without your crown," Alaric observed, unable to keep a note of surprise from his voice. "I wanted to see whether the man in this letter," Alina said, producing his own correspondence from a small pouch at her side, "was speaking to the Queen of Valentine or to Alina Whitmore, the woman he once knew in this very household. I find I wish to know the answer to that question before deciding what, if anything, comes next between us." Alaric studied her for a long moment, understanding the significance of what she was offering him, a chance to prove that his growth over the past year had been genuine, rooted in real change rather than mere political calculation regarding a powerful foreign sovereign. "Then let me show you," he said, "rather than simply telling you." He spent the following days doing exactly that, walking her through the practical reforms he had implemented across the estate, introducing her to staff members whose working conditions had genuinely improved under his revised policies, sharing with her, in quiet, unguarded conversations that echoed the honest dawn discussions they had once shared years earlier, the difficult process of unlearning the rigid, fear-driven lessons that had shaped so much of his early adult life. Alina watched him carefully throughout the visit, testing the sincerity of his transformation against every interaction, every unguarded moment, every small decision that revealed character far more honestly than any carefully composed letter ever could. And slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to believe that the man standing before her now was indeed genuinely different from the frightened Duke who had once offered her gold to erase her from his life. On the final evening of her private visit, they sat together in the same garden where they had once shared an unplanned dawn conversation years earlier, the same spot where Alaric had first begun to recognize feelings he had spent years afterward trying desperately to suppress. The night sky stretched clear and star-filled above them, and for a long while neither of them spoke, content simply to sit together in comfortable silence, a silence that felt entirely different from the cold, formal distance that had once defined their final conversation in his study. "I built an entire kingdom's worth of confidence without your approval," Alina finally said, breaking the silence. "I want you to understand that clearly, Alaric. I do not need you, nor your title, nor your estate, to feel complete or worthy. Whatever choice I make now, I make entirely from my own strength, not from any lingering need for the validation you once withheld from me so cruelly." "I understand that completely," Alaric said quietly, "and I would not want it any other way." You are the strongest, most remarkable person I have ever known, and nothing that happens between us now changes the fact that you built this extraordinary life entirely on your own merit, without any help from me." Alina turned to look at him then, her expression softening in the moonlight. "Then let me tell you what I have decided, having tested your character these past few days against everything you wrote in your letter, against everything Margaret has told me in her correspondence, against my own careful judgment, which I have learned, through hard experience, never to abandon lightly." Alaric waited, his heart pounding, uncertain what verdict she was about to deliver. "I forgive you," Alina said simply. "Not because you are owed forgiveness by any measure of fairness, and not because I have forgotten the pain of that night in your study, but because I believe, having watched you carefully these past days, that your growth is genuine, and because I do not wish to carry old bitterness into whatever future I choose to build, whether that future includes you or not. And I find," she continued, a small smile touching her lips, "that I would like it to include you cautiously and on my own terms, built honestly from this point forward rather than on the broken foundation of what came before." Alaric felt something loosen in his chest that he had carried, tightly wound, since the night he had watched her walk out of his study years earlier. "I will spend however long it takes proving myself worthy of that chance," he said, "on your terms entirely for as long as you require." Alina reached out and took his hand, the same steady, capable hand that had once folded linens and mended coats in this very household, now the hand of a reigning queen who had chosen, freely and on her own terms, to extend a second chance to the man who had once tried so foolishly to erase her from his life. In the months that followed, their relationship developed slowly and carefully, built not on the desperate romantic urgency of youth, but on the patient, honest foundation of two people who had both been transformed by hardship into stronger, wiser versions of themselves. Alina continued to rule Verentine with the same wisdom and compassion that had won her kingdom's devotion, and Alaric continued reforming Ashworth Estate, eventually establishing formal trade partnerships between his lands and her kingdom that benefited both territories considerably. When nearly 2 years after that fateful reunion in the garden, Alaric traveled to Verentine to formally ask for Alina's hand in marriage, he did so not as a duke seeking to elevate his own status through a royal alliance, but as a man who had spent years proving, through honest effort and genuine change, that he was worthy of standing beside the extraordinary woman he had once so carelessly dismissed. Alina, standing before her full royal court, accepted his proposal not out of any obligation or political convenience, but from a place of genuine, hard-won love, built on a foundation far stronger than the one that had crumbled so easily years earlier in his cold, calculating study. The woman he had once offered gold to disappear forever returned instead wearing a crown he had never imagined, and in choosing, freely and on her own unwavering terms, to forgive him and build a future alongside him, she proved that the truest strength lies not in never being wounded, but in rising, again and again, until the life you build becomes entirely your own. Their wedding took place at Verentine's Grand Palace on a bright spring morning, attended by representatives from every noble house across the region, including many who had once doubted Alina's claim to the throne, and now stood as witnesses to a union that symbolized the very best of what her reign had come to represent. The Dowager Duchess Margaret, seated in a place of honor near the front of the assembly, wept openly throughout the ceremony, declaring to anyone who would listen that she had known, from the very first fever-ridden days of her recovery years earlier, that Alina possessed a spirit far too remarkable to remain hidden within the humble confines of a servant's life. Mrs. Foxworth traveled from Belmere to attend as well, along with Margaret Price, both women marveling openly at the transformation of the quiet, diligent seamstress they had once known into the confident, beloved sovereign standing before them in robes of ivory and gold. Mr. Bennet and Ambassador Whitfield, whose early diligence had made the entire remarkable journey possible, stood among the honored guests, each receiving Alina's heartfelt gratitude during the celebrations that followed the ceremony. Duchess Isolde Marchetti, whose early opposition to Alina's claim had once threatened to destabilize the fragile beginnings of her reign, attended as well, her presence a quiet testament to how thoroughly Alina's genuine leadership had won over even her most skeptical critics over the preceding years. The two women had never become close friends, but they had built a working respect between them that served the kingdom well, a respect Alina valued precisely, because it had been earned through demonstrated competence rather than given freely out of obligation. In the years that followed their marriage, Alina and Alaric worked together to strengthen the bond between their two territories, establishing trade routes and cultural exchanges that brought lasting prosperity to both Valentine and Ashworth estate. Alaric, no longer bound by the narrow, fear-driven principles his father had once instilled in him, became known throughout the region as a duke who genuinely valued the well-being of those under his care, a transformation that many attributed directly to the influence of the remarkable woman he had married. Alina never forgot the lessons of her earlier life, the years spent folding linens and mending coats, the months spent bent over fabric under lamplight in Mrs. Foxworth's dress shop, the cold night she had walked away from Ashworth estate with nothing but her dignity and a small wooden box containing her mother's final letter. She often spoke of those years publicly, not with bitterness, but as a reminder to her court and her people that true worth had never depended on titles or birth, that the strength to rebuild a shattered life from nothing was itself a kind of royalty far more meaningful than any crown could bestow. She established, in the years of her reign that followed, an academy dedicated to training young women in trades and skills that had once been closed to them, ensuring that no woman in her kingdom would ever again find herself as vulnerable and uncertain as she had once been, standing alone at a coaching inn with nothing but a small bag and an unanswered question about why the world had turned so suddenly cruel. The academy bore, at Alaric's insistence and Alina's initial reluctant embarrassment, her own name, a lasting tribute to the seamstress who had become a queen through nothing but her own extraordinary resilience. Margaret, the Dowager Duchess, lived long enough to see her great-grandchildren born, spoiling them shamelessly with stories of how their grandmother had once been offered gold to disappear forever, and had instead returned wearing a crown no one could have possibly imagined for her. She told the story so many times with such evident delight that it eventually became something of a legend within both households, retold at family gatherings for generations, a reminder that even the coldest, most calculated decisions could be undone by the quiet, unshakable strength of a woman who refused to accept a price for her own dignity. Alaric, for his part, never stopped being grateful for the second chance he had been given, a chance he understood, with humbled clarity, he had never truly deserved but had worked every day of his life since to become worthy of regardless. He often told their own children, as they grew older, about the terrible mistake he had made in his youth, not to burden them with guilt, but to teach them the same lesson his grandmother had once tried desperately to teach him, that love and duty need not stand in opposition to one another, that true strength lay not in rigid adherence to fear-driven principles, but in the courage to recognize and correct one's own failures before it became too late to make amends. And Alina, ruling her kingdom with the same steady wisdom and compassion that had defined her reign from its very earliest days, remained forever the same woman at heart who had once refused a pouch of gold rather than accept payment for her own humiliation, a woman who understood, better than anyone else in either of their kingdoms, that true worth could never be bought, sold, or erased, no matter how much gold a desperate man might offer, and no matter how far circumstances might carry her from the humble beginnings that had first shaped her unshakable character. The story of the Duke who had once tried to pay a woman to vanish forever, only to watch her return wearing a crown he never imagined, became one told for generations across both their lands, not merely as a tale of romance rediscovered, but as a lasting reminder that dignity, once claimed and never surrendered, would always find its way, eventually, toward the recognition and respect it had rightfully deserved from the very beginning.